So, one of our earliest legends is a good old-fashioned story of romance between two lovers, Alexander Hamilton and William Livingston's daughter, Catherine, or Kitty Livingston. So, this story is one of the favorite legends of the house because, of course, Hamilton is very popular right now with the musical and everything. He's really been like thrusted into stardom in the last few years. And in general, people are really interested in Hamilton's life and stories. And now, as a museum, Liberty Hall wanted to emphasize our connection to Hamilton. So, when we redid the upstairs bedrooms, we made an Alexander Hamilton room. So, this is a picture of that room. Now, you might ask, how is Liberty Hall connected to Hamilton? So, let's get into that story. So Hamilton was born on the island of Nevis in the Caribbean in this home on January 11th, 1755 or 1757, because historical records are not very clear on that. He then moved to the island of St. Croix, where he held a job as a clerk, and he then earned the respect of his employers, who pooled the funding needed to send him to the American colonies so he could further his education. So Hamilton came up to the American colonies in 1772 and enrolled in Francis Barber's grammar school in October of 1772 in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. So this is the present day Snyder Academy in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And this sign hangs outside the building, recognizing that both Hamilton and Burr attended this school. As a new immigrant in the colonies, Hamilton needed a place to stay. As we see in this newspaper announcement, the grammar school recommended that attendees stay with reputable families in the area. The Livingstons had helped sponsor Hamilton's voyage to the colonies, so he ended up moving in with the Livingstons as a boarder for about a year. And this is where he met and supposedly fell in love with Kitty Livingston. One piece of evidence of this budding romance are the letters that Hamilton wrote to Kitty in 1779. He would talk about politics with her and was open to discuss such things as romance and marriage. Hamilton referred to Kitty as one of the Graces, or Diana, or Venus, and called her a fine lady. Very swoon-worthy, right? And he also declared that the end of the revolution would remove those obstacles which now lie in the way of that most delectable thing called matrimony. And from reading these letters, you could definitely assume that Hamilton was on a romantic mission, possibly hoping for a courtship, and then which would then lead to marriage. But of course, we know that Hamilton ultimately did not marry Kitty and instead married a woman by the name Elizabeth, or Eliza Schuyler, in December of 1780, just 1 year after the letters to Kitty. So now that you've heard this story, let's review what parts of the story may be fact and what parts may be fictional. Fact. We know that Hamilton lived with the Livingstons for a period of time, and we also have proof that Hamilton and Kitty wrote letters to each other. But the legend is, did Hamilton really live at Liberty Hall, and were these letters truly love letters? So let's take a look. So the first question is, did Hamilton really live at Liberty Hall? So who thinks, let's see if we can maybe put raise the hands or write it in the chat. Who thinks that Alexander Hamilton actually stayed here at Liberty Hall? Does anybody think this? Maybe, possibly. Okay, I got some hands. Let's see if I can see anyone. I got some more hands. Okay, so we're kind of thinking that he possibly did. There's actually a small problem with the legend that Hamilton lived in Liberty Hall, because Hamilton was looking for a place to board in 1772, and Liberty Hall wasn't built until 1774. But Hamilton did board with the Livingstons. So where were the Livingstons if they weren't at Liberty Hall? Well, the Livingstons were actually renting a house from a man by the name of Jacob DeHart somewhere in Elizabethtown. We aren't sure which house exactly because DeHart owned two properties, which you can see here and here. So they were staying in one of these two properties. Over here is where Hamilton School was. Hamilton would have stayed with the Livingstons for about 10 or 11 months, but Liberty Hall was actually still being designed. But some good news, Hamilton most likely did visit Liberty Hall when it was completed. So that room named the Alexander Hamilton room, it's more for fun than anything. And they named the room that to show him or to show that we have a connection to him, but not because he actually stayed in that room. So where were Hamilton and Kitty really sending love letters is the next question. Let's see.
Hey,
Oh, someone
Michaela.
is saying they're hearing a scratching noise. Is
Yes,
that for me?
I think so because you're the one talking. So if you can maybe decrease your volume, it might just be extra feedback.
Sure.
We'll try it
Okay, let's see that.
or move a little
Okay.
bit farther away. Yeah.
Is
We'll s-
this better?
just keep it on. We'll let you know.
Okay. Okay, sounds good. Sorry about that. So as I was saying, so the next question is, were Hamilton and Kitty really sending love letters to each other? So, despite the fact that Hamilton's letters were definitely flirtatious, some scholars actually don't think they were love letters. Hamilton wrote nothing about specifically his love or affection for Kitty. He struck a playful tone that touched upon the topics of love and marriage, asking Kitty what she thought about the possibility of going down that path, but without expressing any of his own affection for her. So he referred to Kitty as a goddess and a fine girl as he knew her to be, but he never actually expressed his own emotions for her. So in comparison, let's see, there we go. This is Kitty. So in comparison to letters that Hamilton sent to his soon to be wife, Eliza Schuyler, in 1780, in these letters, he addressed his own emotions and said, I have told you, and I told you truly, that I love you too much. You engross my thoughts too entirely to allow me to think of anything else. You not only employ my mind all day, but you intrude upon my sleep. I meet you in every dream, and when I wake, I cannot close my eyes again for ruminating on your sweetness. So I'll let you decide if Hamilton had similar feelings for Kitty and for Eliza, but it definitely sounds like he had more personal feelings toward Eliza than Kitty. I've also heard that there was a third letter to an unknown woman. So he was sending letters to all three women at the same time. But again, that's another legend, right? Is the sound better
So I noticed
now?
every time you say S, like so, it's the fricative of the S that's coming out. So it's just your S's. You have
Okay.
you're heavily fric what is that word? Fricatate. Yes, that's all. That's all. So if you could just maybe move back a little bit. Anyone else who are listening, you can turn down your volume because we certainly don't want to miss what Michaela is doing and saying.
All right. Okay, so the next legend is the hidden papers. So now let's talk about the heart of the Revolutionary War. So many of our favorite legends date back to the late 1770s, and many actually revolve around this woman, Susan Livingston Simms, who was the oldest daughter of William Livingston. So Susanna Livingston, or Susan Livingston Simms, um, or Susan as we called her, was born in 1748 and was the oldest child of William and Susanna that survived into adulthood. So in 1772, at the age of 24, Susan was still not married, so she moved with her family to Elizabethtown, New Jersey, and moved into Liberty Hall. And at that time, if you were 24 and not married, you were like an old spinster at that time. Many people were married before then. And she was actually really concerned that when they moved out of New York City to New Jersey. At the time, it was basically in the middle of nowhere in rural New Jersey. We're very built up and busy now, but back then it was not like that. She compared it to being sent to a cloister. She was like, I'm never going to find anybody out here in New Jersey. You're taking me away from the social life in New York City. But nonetheless, she's involved in many of our family legends. So she did not have a boring life out here. So this particular legend takes place in the spring of 1779. Susan's father, William Livingston, was serving as the general of the New Jersey militia and New Jersey's elected governor. And he could not spend a lot of time at Liberty Hall because his patriotic duties actually made him a wanted man by the British. And so they would come here looking for him. And so he couldn't stay in his own house. He had to go and hide out with other friends. And according to this legend, one time when the soldiers came and they couldn't find Livingston, they let their frustration and anger out by hacking into the banister with their swords. And you can still feel the marks on the railing today. And another time in the spring of 1779, the British heard a rumor that William Livingston was staying at Liberty Hall and sent Brigadier General Sir Thomas Sterling with 1,000 troops to capture him. And when the British arrived, Susan confronted the soldiers, telling them her father was not at home. And the soldiers, of course, demanded to search the house because if they couldn't find William Livingston, they at least wanted to find his personal papers, right? He was a lawyer. He was also a general and a governor at this time. So he must have had important papers with important information on them. And they wanted to find these papers that would have had information about the state of the revolution in New Jersey, detailed orders about for the militia, and even lists of names of people who were spies for Washington, right? And so when the major in charge of the search for the papers reached Livingston's desk, Susan got worried because his papers were actually in the desk. And Susan came up with this idea to try to get them to avoid looking in this desk where the papers were. And she asked the British officer to not search the desk by saying, "In here are letters that I have exchanged with a certain gentleman. If you are a gentleman, you will not disturb them." And British officers prided themselves on being gentlemen and agreed not to read Susan's letters if she gave up William Livingston's papers. So she told them to go into the study and climb the ladder to the upper shelves of a bookcase and began hauling down huge batches of papers. Susan pretended to agree and pretended to be upset and regretfully gave the British stacks of bound papers from the library. The British, not being smart, not thinking, accepted these papers without first reading them and took them back to their camp. The legend says that when the British went to look at those papers, their spirits were absolutely crushed. It turns out that the stacks of paper that were provided by Susan were several dozen sheaves of old law briefs dating back to the 1750s when William Livingston was a lawyer in New York City. So it was basically just old trash that actually really needed to be recycled, but it was the 1700s and they didn't really do that. So she prevented them from looking at the actual papers in the desk by saying they were paper, letters from her lover, and instead gave them her dad's trash to look at. And so Susan's courage and trickery saved her father's papers and, in turn, the patriot cause. And she was really a hero. So, what are some facts versus legends of this story? Well, some facts. William Livingston did live on the run during the Revolution, and British troops came looking for Livingston multiple times. Now, the questions are, did Lord Sterling really come with 1,000 troops to capture Livingston? Were the papers really hidden inside a desk? And was it Susan who hid the papers? So the first question, did Lord Stirling really bring 1,000 troops? Well, we actually think that he did. Multiple history books report that General Clinton personally authorized a secret expedition of 1,000 soldiers, which was an especially substantial raiding force to seize Governor Livingston at Liberty Hall. The raiders supposedly surrounded Liberty Hall around 5 a.m., and Sterling later wrote to Clinton, the rebel governor Livingston had noticed and left his house before we got there. The New Jersey Journal later reported on the incident and said that Livingston had spent the night at the home of a friend. The next question, were the papers really hidden inside the locked desk? Well, some say that Susan actually hid the small box of Livingston's papers under her dress, and then sent the soldiers to look in the library, never even mentioning the locked desk. So that's one version of the story. Her skirts at that time would have gone to the floor. So as long as she didn't move, no one would have ever found the papers, and no, you know, respectable British officer would go looking under a lady's skirts. Um, but how do we have two versions of the same story? So we imagine that the locked desk version of the story came about in the 1800s when cane ladies were telling it to their friends over tea. In the Victorian era, though, the hiding of something underneath the lady's dress was incredibly scandalous. So perhaps the cane ladies changed the story to make it more appropriate. But ultimately, we'll never know for sure. And of course, the big question, was it really Susan who hid the papers? So that is how the story was passed down through time, through the family members. But we recently discovered information that would lead us to believe it was Judith Livingston, who was William Livingston's youngest child. We found an article from the New York Times dated 1877 from a friend of Judith Livingston, a woman named Julia Lawrence. And in this article, Julia is referencing another article that had been published in the New York World in December of 1875. And she is writing a correction of what was mentioned in that article. So this is a very convoluted story, but I'm going to say it anyways. So the New York World article must have stated that someone, not Judith, hid the papers because Mrs. Lawrence writes, but it was the governor's daughter, Judith, who married Mr. Watkins some years after, who was the guardian of the valuable papers and concealed them. So we don't know who Mrs. Julia Lawrence is, but she gives us information that might change our story. So that's just something to ponder. The next legend takes us to 1780, and we call this legend the Rose in the Garden. Um, so this legend is a small story that is actually part of a larger legend. So just to help us get a sense of where we are, this is a map from 1777 from the Library of Congress depicting northern New Jersey. So this is over here, we have Staten Island and we have Elizabethtown. So Staten Island, Elizabethtown. At the time, Union, New Jersey was a part of Elizabethtown. So Liberty Hall was in Elizabethtown. So it is a little hard to see, so that's why I zoomed in. And this is a detailed image of this area from the map. So we have Elizabethtown, and this is where Liberty Hall is located. And in 1780, General Washington was encamped in Morristown with the Continental Army. And in June of that year, British and Hessian soldiers came up from Staten Island and crossed through Elizabethtown, past Liberty Hall, trying to get to General Washington. On the way past Liberty Hall, the Hessian commander, Colonel Ludwig Johann Adolf von Worm, spoke to Susan. Yes, that name is a mouthful. He promised her no harm will come to the house, stationed guards by the house, and then asked if he can call on her. We all know what that means. That he wanted to see her again, take her out on a date, etc., etc. So instead of accepting his courtship, she offered him a rose to put in his hat from the rose bush and told him that whatever the outcome of the next battle, she hoped the rose would protect him from the bullets. In my opinion, this is the ultimate way to turn down a guy. Go give him a flower and send him off to battle. Now, like I said, this is a short legend. So, the facts. The British did march past Liberty Hall while trying to reach Morristown and General Washington, and the Hessian troops were led by Colonel Worm. The question, was Worm really interested in Susan? And did she really send him away with a rose? So there is actually a high probability of this, but nothing is known for sure. Livingston's three eldest daughters, Susan, Kitty, and Sarah, were known as the Three Graces. Winning one of them would have been quite a prize. Excuse me. And we have plenty of records of other men being interested in Susan. So why not Colonel von Worm as well? The only real issue is that Susan, of course, is the daughter of the general of the New Jersey militia, the enemy of Colonel Worm. And of course, he would have known that. So I question if he really would have asked to court her, a daughter of the enemy. But if so, handing him a rose would have been a polite way for Susan to send him away. One thing we do know for sure is that the rose did indeed protect him. He lived until 1813, but he never had any luck with women and died unmarried. Very sad story, end to that story. Next, this is actually one of our most famous legends. So this legend is called the Ghost of Hannah Caldwell. We actually have a whole separate program just talking about this legend. And so we find, again, it's still 1780. This is still happening, where the British soldiers are marching to Morristown from Staten Island to capture General Washington's army. And the story continues with perhaps, as I said, our most famous legend here at Liberty Hall. So back on the battlefield, so this is after the whole Rose incident, the British forces met with the New Jersey militia in the town of Connecticut Farms. In Connecticut Farms, the two armies met and bitter fighting ensued, but then it started to rain, and the British decided to give up and march back to Staten Island. On their way back, they again passed by Liberty Hall, but this time they were not so friendly. It was raining and thundering and lightning. The soldiers were tired and wet. They were defeated, and many of them would have been drunk. And so now let's back up a little bit. So we're going to go back to when they were passing by Liberty Hall again in really bad spirits. Because during the Battle of Connecticut Farms, something very important happened. During this battle, the British, supposedly accidentally, but that's still up for debate, shot and killed a woman named Hannah Caldwell as she hid in her home. Hannah was the wife of a Reverend James Caldwell, who was hated by the British for his fiery patriotic sermons and recruiting efforts. So many people believed that his wife was targeted for assassination. Either way, word of this murder had traveled very fast among the British ranks. So, and at this time, it's also important to note, just as I was saying with the whole papers thing in the desk, war was a gentleman's game sport, right? Women and children were not supposed to be collateral damage of war. War was between the men who were battling, the men who were fighting. So to have a woman who was hiding in her home, the wife of a patriotic reverend, a patriot reverend, I mean, was very shocking that a British soldier would shoot a woman in her home. So that's why it caused a lot of issues. Made a lot of waves. And so as the soldiers marched back to Staten Island, they passed right by Liberty Hall. And when the soldiers reached Liberty Hall, they were angry and frustrated that they lost the battle and that they couldn't find the governor. So a very few drunk soldiers decided to try and burn down the home. Livingston's wife and children were hiding in an upstairs bedroom in the house. And as one of the soldiers went upstairs looking for the family, Susan decided she was once again going to be the brave and courageous soul she was, and she was going to tell them to leave. So remember, it is in the middle of a thunderstorm, and this is a very key piece of information. It's in the middle of a thunderstorm. And as the soldier is walking up the stairs, Susan opens the bedroom door on the landing, and a huge lightning bolt lights the sky. The soldier sees the silhouette of Susan on the landing, wearing her white nightgown and holding a candle, and he thinks this must be the ghost of the murdered Hannah Caldwell. The soldier is terrified and flees down the stairs. Susan followed him down the stairs and demanded the rest of the British soldiers leave her house. And it worked. Susan convinced or scared the soldiers into leaving and ultimately saved Liberty Hall because of it. In fact, the murder of Hannah Caldwell that caused this story with the ghost in the first place is actually depicted on the seal of Union County, where our the county that our museum is in. It is the only seal in the United States that depicts a murder on it. So go Union County, I guess. And this seal is actually historically inaccurate, but it's so that it can show what happened. But having the woman on the outside of the house, the story is, or history tells us, that Hannah Caldwell was actually inside of her house and she was shot through a window. So this isn't even historically accurate, but it's still, I guess, a fun fact that this is the only county seal that depicts a murder on it. So, facts versus legends of this fun story. Well, the facts are Hannah Caldwell was killed during the Battle of Connecticut Farms. This is a widely recognized fact. We don't know, however, the true circumstances of her death. Was she killed by a stray bullet, or did a soldier purposefully kill her? We do know that word of her death traveled fast, and she ended up as like a type of martyr for the Patriot cause and a shame on the British. And you can also visit her house, the Caldwell Parsonage in Union, New Jersey. It's not that far from our museum. And the seal of Union County depicts the murder of Hannah Caldwell. That picture I showed you on the last slide is the actual seal of Union County. And yes, it depicts a murder. The seal depicts it as an intentional murder, but as I said, we don't know if it was intentional or not. But the questions remain. Who was the ghost of Liberty Hall? Was there a ghost at all, or is this just a fun story? So, who was the ghost of Hannah Caldwell? So I told you that Susan was the ghost, but for a long time, people thought Kitty was the ghost of Hannah Caldwell instead of Susan. However, we do know now that Kitty was in Philadelphia during this battle, so she wasn't at Liberty Hall. It couldn't have been her. And that would make us think it's definitely Susan, right? Well, the ghost story actually still remains a mystery because years later in the 1800s, again, William Livingston's youngest daughter, Judith, claimed she was the ghost. All of her older siblings had passed away by this time, so no one could refute her. So we will probably never know for sure who scared those British soldiers away that night. But remember, Judith also allegedly hid the papers. So maybe she was more involved than we actually know, or she claimed these things when all of her siblings were dead and no one could argue with her. So just keep that in mind. And of course, the question is, was there really a ghost at all, or was this a fun story? So we actually don't know, but either way, this is one of the most famous stories here at Liberty Hall. The last resident to live here, we saw a picture of her earlier, Mary Alice Varney Kane, she actually loved the stories so much that she commissioned an artist to paint a depiction of Susan as the ghost in the house. This painting now lives behind a door to the old stairwell to the attic. So it's just like a door on on the landing of the second floor, and you open it, and there's a light, like a kind of like a refrigerator light. It turns on, and there's this cool painting, like life-size painting of the ghost. Um, and when you open the door, you come face to face with the ghost of Liberty Hall. So it's kind of spooky and fun. And this is definitely a story that we tell. And we definitely show this painting a lot more around this time of year because it's a little spooky and fun. And like the artist added a black cat at the bottom. For what? The black cat doesn't really have anything to do with it. But again, it enhances that kind of spooky, supernatural theme. So we have two more legends, I think, to go. So this one is called The Room Over the Library. So we're moving forward in time to 1789. And this one actually involves a very famous American, and it is quite curious and strange. So the next legend is A Room Over the Library, and it has something to do with these two very well-known individuals, George and Martha Washington. So in 1789, George has his first inauguration in New York City as president. Fun fact, in 1789, New York City was the capital, not DC. It was, I believe, it was New York City was the capital first of the US, and then it was Philadelphia. And then there was a deal that was made between the northern and the southern colonies, and the capital was moved to Washington, D.C. So George Washington's inauguration was not in Washington, D.C., it was in New York City. So Martha Washington actually did not attend her husband's inauguration. She instead stayed at Mount Vernon in Virginia and traveled north about a month later. On her trip north, she stayed at all the important homes between Virginia and New Jersey. So, of course, she would have stayed at Liberty Hall. At Liberty Hall, I actually need to change this picture because it looks different now. We have a room called the Martha Washington Room. According to legend, this room was specifically built for Martha just for her one night visit. So imagine, this is the story that has been told that the Livingstons were hosting Martha Washington, so they built her an entire room just for that one night stay. But this is how the legend goes. Then in the morning, after the inauguration, George came to Liberty Hall to pick up his wife and had breakfast with the Livingstons. This is the story. So, the facts. Martha Washington did stay a night with the Livingstons at Liberty Hall. And two, Martha Washington did not attend her husband's inauguration, but she came up a month after. But some of the legends. Was this room really built just for Martha Washington and just for one night stay? That sounds kind of crazy, right? Well, let's figure it out. So, there's reason to believe the room was probably not built for Martha. This room was probably built in the 1820s or 1830s. In the 1820s, a man by the name of Colonel John Kane, was the head of the house. And this man had many children. Because of that, he added several rooms to the house during this time period. This was actually the time period in like the mid 1800s where most of the renovations on the house were done. Because Colonel John Kane was involved in the water company, the railroad, the gas company, all of those things. So the major companies at that time, he had a hand in all of them. So he was very wealthy, and they had a lot of adult children that did not get married. And so they just lived at home with their parents. And so he was like, well, you guys need your own space. So he made a lot of renovations and added a lot of rooms onto the house for that reason. And we actually know that the Martha Washington room was the bedroom of one of his unmarried sons, Julian. And we can also look, strangely enough, at the floorboards to help us figure this out. The room on the left here is the Alexander Hamilton room from earlier, which we know for a fact was built in 1774. The floorboards in this room are about 13 inches wide. The floorboards in the Washington room on the right are about 8 inches wide. Old houses with their original floorboards are wider than floorboards in houses built in the 1820s because the big old wide trees that existed in the 1700s were gone by the 1820s. So craftsman techniques used to cut wide floorboards were being replaced by machines that cut much smaller boards. So, as a recap, the legend says that the room was built for Martha Washington in 1789, but the floorboards suggest this room wasn't actually built until the 1820s. So now you know when you go to an old house, you can see if their floors are original. So if they claim to be from the 1700s, you can check to see if the floors are original by looking at how wide the planks are on the floorboards or the floorboards are. So, how did this legend start? Well, in 1879, a book was written that said Martha Washington stayed in the room above the library. And the issue here is that multiple rooms could have actually been the library during this time. In 1789, when Martha's room was supposedly built, Liberty Hall only had 14 rooms, and it was likely that the Great Hall was the library. Above the Great Hall are rooms are rooms are two bedrooms, sorry, that today we call the Alexander Hamilton room and the Sarah and Peter Kane room. However, at one point in time, the modern day dining room, one of the original 14 rooms, was a library. And above this room is indeed the room that we call the Martha Washington room. When Martha was visiting, her bedroom didn't exist. So she likely slept in either of the rooms we call the Alexander Hamilton room or the Sarah and Peter Kane room, thus above the library, which was in the Great Hall. And perhaps the author of the book did not know when the library was in the Great Hall versus when the dining room and when the dining room was the library, and assumed that the dining room had always served as the library. Following the logic, if the Martha Washington room wasn't one of the original rooms, it must have been added to the house and been built for Martha because otherwise that room would not have existed during 1789. However, even if this room wasn't built only for Martha Washington for only one night stay, to be honest, I would like to believe that someday someone would build me my own entire room just for one night if I was visiting, right? That sounds like a fun story. You're so important that someone would build you an entire bedroom for one night. But we all know that's not realistic. We're probably not that important, but it's fun to dream. So basically, this book was just kind of misguided. The library had been in what we call the Great Hall, and there were two rooms above the Great Hall. One of them probably is where Martha stayed. I've also been told that she might have stayed on the main level because the main level is right above the kitchens. So it would have been more comfortable to be right above the heat, especially for an esteemed guest. So I'm not even really sure if she stayed in a bedroom on the second floor. It might have been more comfortable for her to stay on the main floor where she can get more heat and things like that if it's cold. But I digress. So this is our last legend that we are talking about today. Also a fun legend about lovers and forbidden love and things like that. This one is called the elopement out the window. And it also involves some other famous Americans. So welcome to the Victorian parlor. During the colonial era or in the 1770s, this room was the dining room as a dining room and then later a parlor. If these walls could talk, this room would have heard a lot of secrets and gossip, and this room was the location of an alleged elopement. Well, one of the most famous legends of this room involved the future ninth president of the United States, William Henry Harrison, and William Livingston's step granddaughter, Anna Cleves Sims. Anna Sims was the stepdaughter of William Livingston's oldest daughter, Susan. Susan was married to John Cleve Sims, who brought his daughter Anna into the marriage. William Henry Harrison was in love with Anna and wanted to marry her, but Anna's father, John, did not approve of the marriage. So William and Anna decided to take matters into their own hands and decided to elope, which means they ran away secretly in order to get married without parental consent. According to legend, William and Anna were here at Liberty Hall and had waited until John, Anna's father, had left on a business trip and eloped out of the window in the Victorian parlor. I guess they couldn't leave through the front doors because someone would have been more likely to stop them. So we have a painting that depicts this event. In this painting, we see Anna escaping out the window, standing on the beehive oven that stuck out from the back of the kitchen below. And then we see William Henry Harrison helping her down. And then this other crying lady must be a servant of some kind who is just very stressed about the whole situation. When Anna's father found out that she had eloped, and he apparently shouted at William, "How, sir, do you intend to support my daughter?" William replied, "Sir, my sword and my right arm." At this time, William Henry Harrison was a soldier, so of course he was going to use his sword as his means of income. But of course, we know he eventually became the ninth president of the United States, so he did pretty well for himself. And so this brings us to, again, the facts and the legends. So we know that William Henry Harrison and Anna Cleve Sims did get married in 1795. And we also know that Anna's father did not approve of Harrison, so the couple did elope. What we don't know is whether the couple really climbed out of the Victorian parlor's window. So this is a very interesting story. History tells us that Harrison and Sims were married without their parents' permission on November 25th, 1795, at the North Bend home of Stephen Wood, Treasurer of the Northwest Territory. So let's think about this. Here is a map of the country around 1795. As you can see, we love our maps here. And here is a detailed image of the area we are discussing. William Henry Harrison and Anna were from Ohio. They met in Ohio when William was a commander at Fort Washington near Cincinnati. You all are from Ohio, right? Or maybe that's somewhere else.
We're from Maryland.
Program.
Yeah.
Oh, from Maryland.
Yeah.
I'm doing another program later with a group from Ohio. That's why I got confused. Thank you. So they met in Ohio when William was commander at Fort Washington near Cincinnati. And so why would they come all the way to New Jersey from Ohio to elope only to go back to Ohio and get married? Ohio and Liberty Hall are over 600 miles away. It would have taken several weeks to travel that distance. In 1795. And it seems unlikely to me that they would have traveled from Ohio to New Jersey to run away in New Jersey only to return to Ohio to be married. We believe that this story of the eloping out the Victorian parlor window came about during the Victorian era when some of the ladies of Liberty Hall realized the connection between the home and William Henry Harrison and decided to make the story seem a little bit more exciting. So today we actually talked about six legends of six of Liberty Hall's most endearing legends. And we heard stories of her forbidden love, deception, courage, ghosts, and historical figures. And I want to thank you very much for listening to all my stories. And I hope you enjoyed hearing some tall tales and figuring out what was truly fact or legend. So now I have some time. So this is just some contact info if anyone is interested, but I have time if anybody has any questions or anything they want to discuss. We have some time left over. And I always say I attempt to answer questions because sometimes people come up with really good questions that I've never been asked before. So I always find that intriguing.
I'm going to invite you all to either unmute yourself or drop questions in the chat if you're a quick typer. If you're not a quick typer, it might just be easier for you to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Question, please. I'd like to know, is the house open year round or is there a certain time, if you want to come to the area to tour it?
Yes, so we're closed in like January, February, March. We're technically closed unless you kind of book a program or an event in advance. We're open April through December. We have tours Wednesdays through Sundays at 11, 1, and 3. You can always check our website that I have on here. We keep it updated with a lot of events. And we have events when we're open. So we December we have holiday teas. In the summer, we have various garden tours and things like that. So, yeah, that's a very good question.
Okay, thank
Please,
you.
we'd love to have you come visit.
Sounds good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Mm,
We have a question in the chat.
chat.
Yeah, it says how much of the collection is original or replicas? And we have another question in a minute too as well.
Yes, I see. So, our collection is we have a very extensive collection. It depends on the era of history. So, for example, our colonial collection that is original is very small because the Livingstons, after William Livingston died, they moved, I believe, to Massachusetts. So they took a lot of their stuff with them. However, when we talk about um, the Kane family first moved in 1811, and several subsequent generations of the Kane family lived in the house until 1995. They weren't hoarders, but they kept a lot of stuff. They were very wealthy. They bought a lot of stuff. And if you can imagine, if I don't know if anybody has a home that's been passed down through your family, I feel like that's not very popular or that doesn't happen a lot. But if you can imagine, the next generation would move in and then, oh, grandma's stuff is here. Let's just put it up in the attic. They just did that for years and years and years and years. And so we, as a museum, the Kane family still technically owns their stuff, but it is part of the collection. So much of our collection from 1811 to 95 is original to the house, and also much of it is original to the Kane family. And it's also interesting because when the last family lived in the house with, inspired by Mary Alice, they wanted to open the house as a museum. They also started buying things from time periods of the house. So, for example, Stuart Kane bought some clocks from the 1700s that were made in Elizabethtown, New Jersey, and we have them in the house. So, were they owned by the Livingstons? No. Were they in the house during the 1700s? No, but they were from the time period. So, it's a very complicated answer. A lot of our stuff is original. We do have some replicas here and there, especially for our education programming. We have a lot of replicas or reproductions, but most of the stuff in our house is original to the house or owned by one of the families, most likely the Kane family, though. We have a lot of stuff, a lot of stuff. Okay, next question. How large is the town of Elizabethtown? So Elizabethtown doesn't exist anymore. It was split up between Elizabeth, the city, and Union Township, where we are technically in. Elizabethtown, I don't know the exact measurements. It was pretty big though. It was very prosperous in the 1700s because has a port. Elizabeth has a port, and so having a city or a town on the port at that time gave you access to trade, to travel, and things like that. So I'm not sure how big it was, but it was definitely very influential to the history of New Jersey, if that helps. But now it's been kind of split up between Elizabeth, the city, and Union Township. Okay. Are there any other questions? see.
Well, I'm not seeing any or hearing any. So, Michaela, we want to thank you for your time and just
There's
this
one more
experience.
question.
Oh, we do.
Oh, yay.
I put it in the chat, but I'll just say it. Someone asked about the fire museum that was on the property
Oh, yes,
and how
yes.
big it
So,
was.
yeah, so our firehouse museum, it's actually directly next to the blue house that I'm in. So it's kind of a white building. It's not very big. But Stuart Kane, he he was one of the last children to live in the house. He unfortunately passed away, but he collected firefighting memorabilia and things like that as a child. And then when he grew up and got the cane, I like to call it the big boy money, he um, he collected actual vintage fire trucks. So we have actual vintage fire trucks, one from 1911 and a couple other ones from the 1900s. So it's a big enough building to hold those fire trucks, but it's not like a huge museum. There's like a glass case with a lot of the stuff that he collected from various time periods. And then we have the fire trucks. So it's really unique. Not a lot of people, not a lot of historic house museums also have vintage fire trucks. But again, I guess it goes to show you what I was saying about the Canes collected a lot of stuff and a lot of historic stuff. So yeah, it's pretty cool. All right, let's see. You're so welcome, everybody. I love doing these, bringing the museum to you when you can't come to the museum.
Oh, it shows. Thank you, Michaela. It really
You're
does. We
welcome.
appreciate you. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you for the senior centers also for joining us in this way. And we have other opportunities to go to virtual places. So please keep a lookout for that. And Michaela, can you put up your contact information one more time, just as people
Sure.
are leaving, just in case someone would like that?
Okay, let's see.
Thank you all. And we really do hope you have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Enjoy
you.
it. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone.
Thanks again, Michaela. We appreciate
You're
you.
welcome.
I talk to you later.
Talk to you later.